Now I'd like to welcome to the show Shoshana Weissmann, Digital Media Director and Policy Fellow at the R Street Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Shoshana.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, now, as I'm sure you know, one of our recurring themes on the show is economic opportunity in America, both how much of it there is and how much more we could create with some good policy reform. So let's talk about the latter, making it legal to actually get a job. So give us the quick overview. What is the deal with occupational licenses in America, and why do we make people get a license just to get certain jobs in the first place?
When people think of licensed occupations, I think they're thinking like electricians, plumbers, maybe doctors, lawyers, stuff like that. But people don't know that in Louisiana, you need a license to be a florist, and there's a very strong florist lobby defending it. This is the case that got me into the issue. Years ago, I heard about a woman named Sandy Meadows who basically tried to be a florist when her husband passed away. She had never had to provide for herself, and she was learning and was good at arranging flowers, which you would think is a thing you could just like go and do and like be fine with. But not so in Louisiana. It's the only state where you need a license. So she tried to pass the exams and get through the screening, but she couldn't. It wasn't because it's really hard. The pass rate for the Louisiana florist exam was actually lower than the bar exam, which is ridiculous. Um, so she worked illegally in a grocery. They loved her. There were no issues. There were no epidemics of harm caused by her. But when the state found out, they shut her down and said, "Hey, either you're firing her or we're shutting down the whole grocery." So the grocery couldn't, there was nothing they could have done about it. So when she passed away, she was in poverty because government wouldn't let her work. So there's too many stories like that. We license hair braiders, hair shampooers, manicurists, everything from that up into doctors and lawyers. And while I think we should license doctors, I think we should allow them to work across state lines. And while I think that there's a case for licensing lawyers that I kind of go back and forth on, if you want to have some screenings, well, there's not a lot of evidence behind the process we have working at all now to make better lawyers and functional lawyers. Even with electricians, I was open to it. I thought it might have been a fine thing to license them, but there's studies that show when you license electricians, harm caused by electricity goes up because people try their hand at it at home. So
Hmm.
even when it might make sense to license someone, you still want to make sure that the outcome is what you would want it to be and that you're not making it worse in the name of trying to make it better. And there's also other barriers. Sometimes it's registration, like the constant line I hear about contractors is you have to license them or else they'll skip out of town with people's money. You don't need a license for that. You need them to just register and say, "Here's me in the system, and if I skip out of town, you'll be able to find me," stuff like that. So there's all different kinds of barriers, and the way they're put into place genuinely is sometimes trying to protect the public. Other times it's lobbies. There's even a recent study showing that like when a professional association forms in a state, they increase licensing burdens or get something licensed fairly quickly, and that's not great. So lots of different sides to the issue. We even make it hard for immigrants to work here, people from other states to work across state lines, people who were formerly incarcerated to work in a profession. So there's lots of sides to the issue, but it's all pretty bleak. But it's improving, but bleak.
All right. Well, you have opened up a lot of threads here that we will follow
So
up.
many threads.
So you mentioned that there's maybe a stronger case for licensing someone like a physician, and then probably the weakest case for someone licensing someone like a florist, or at least requiring they be licensed before they can practice profession. And it seems like we've seen a sort of like mission creep when it comes to licensing. So you
Yeah.
start with those professions that arguably do have a real health and safety impact, like physicians, but then it's sort of grown and expanded till you get to the florist, interior decorator, funeral director kind of categories. Is this inevitable? Is this a sort of public choice type scenario where people are they're chasing clout, they're chasing profit? How did we get from licensing doctors to licensing florists?
Yeah, so it's a lot of rent seeking. It's definitely a lot of rent seeking. It's also a lot of won't somebody think of the children? Um, a great example of something that didn't happen but came too close to happening was years ago, and actually it continued on long after the public expose. PetSmart was killing dogs, straight up killing dogs. Their groomers, especially New Jersey, I think it was like focused on New Jersey. killing dogs. They knew about it and they didn't do anything. I don't think people even know what happened, but dogs would go in to get groomed and they would come out dead or on their deathbeds or really, really sick. So something was happening, very obvious and easy to fix. But when there were hearings on it and when the legislators found out, they're like, oh, well, we're going to have to license pet groomers. Well, the 16-year-old kid was not the problem, and the proposed legislation would have made the age limit 18. So if your 7-year-old kid washed your neighbor's dog for $5, that would have been illegal, even though the kid was not killing the dogs. It was PetSmart. PetSmart was encouraging it, one, to get the government off their back, which, you kind of get that, even though PetSmart was fully in the wrong. Sometimes these things happen and it's not the company's fault. This is not one of those times. It was very clearly PetSmart's fault, but it was why don't we do something, puppies, and then the company encouraging it. And you have those impulses. You have the won't someone think of the children? You have the one bad thing ever happened and we need a law to stop it. Oftentimes things are already against the law and they just want to create preemptive barriers. And while it can be a good idea, sometimes, like I think with doctors, it's like you've never heard of like a really good unlicensed doctor. Like, oh man, you got to pay under the table, but this guy will like fix your kidneys. Like that's not a thing that happens. If it did, I might say like let's consider. But there's the unlicensed doctor stories are never positive. But with florists, the unlicensed florist stories are positives. You paint your nails at home, you do your hair at home. So all these things you kind of have to think within reason, and it's manifest causes of why we keep seeing this growth.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. If you can think of all the things that people routinely do for themselves, at the very least, you should say, well, those probably shouldn't be mandatory licensed occupations, because if it's something that half of the time we just don't want to pay for it, so we just do it on our own, then we probably don't need like an entire state bureaucracy to register that. Whereas I'm not going to do my own appendectomy.
Yeah, exactly. Or like even with legal work, you might not be up for that. I'm still not sure it needs to be licensed. I'm open-minded and I'm not making the perfect the enemy of the good, but I feel like there's, people do legal work on their own when they can't afford lawyers. I'm not saying it's always the best outcome, but it is something that you can reasonably do. Um, and then yeah, like hair stuff. I mean, all of that. I have rainbow hair and I dye it myself. I bleach it myself. And even when there's health and safety concerns of like you want to make sure that that you don't spread infection, there's other barriers. There's health inspections. That's a better way to do it because cosmetologists are heavily licensed, and there's many studies that show it's around 30% of salons have various health violations and like serious ones. So the licensing isn't solving the issue. Why not do more health inspections? Enforcement is a better way to go than just creating barriers to entry.
Yeah, I know my grandmother, God rest her soul, spent a lot of money on cosmetology school in the late 1930s. I still have her diploma from the Oregon State Cosmetology Board in 1938, and it turns out she didn't even like working with all the chemicals, so she didn't end up becoming a lifetime cosmetologist. So she
Did
probably could
she?
have probably could have learned that without all of the like expensive
Yeah.
training.
That's the other thing. You can't just go to cosmetology school to learn how to braid hair or cut hair. You go for a million different things, even if it's not the thing you want to do. So, shampooers have to have these freaking credentials. And my hairstylist, actually, she's very good and she's very good with color, but she's a little gun shy because like I think she does more fun colors on herself than anyone else. So she actually asked me for advice about how I would dye hair. And I gave her a hair layer map, like, here's how you do it. And she would have loved my help. But beyond advising her, I couldn't go with her and help the client because I'm not licensed, which is silly. It's like she's right there. But if I'm not in school, if it's not part of the program, it would be illegal for me to help her dye someone's hair, something I do for myself all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's another example here of how a lot of these regulatory barriers, once they get written into law, they're not good at changing with the times. And so,
Right.
you mentioned the hair braiders. This is something that the occupational licensing nerds, the people in the in this policy world who read about this a lot, I'm sure have read about. Our good friends at the Institute for Justice have represented people who are fighting these restrictions. And one of the points they made is if you're doing, say, traditional African hair braiding, and you say you have someone who is an immigrant from Western Africa, and they've come and they're going to
Yeah.
do something they've known to do since they were a child, not only do they have to go to cosmetology school to learn all this stuff and then they have to pay for all the training, cosmetology school doesn't teach them how to do that anyway. That's
Yeah,
not part,
exactly.
like the rules for what you learn in a lot of state cosmetology boards were written in like the 30s and 40s, and they are, teach you how to do hairstyles no one has ordered in 50 years, and say nothing about what people in this category actually want to do and are already experts at.
Exactly. Like, I'm not even sure. I would assume they teach deposit dyes versus chemical dyes, but they work very differently. And new dyes, I mean, like different dye brands alone, like function very differently. Like Manic Panic fades like nothing, but Joico is really great. And I use it exclusively now. It's the same price, but it lasts forever. And like, I'm not sure that a lot of cosmetologists would know the difference just because they haven't had to do it before. Like, I go to this woman because she's really good and knows my hair and like she's really good at working with it. I stopped going to another cosmetologist because they had no idea how to work with color. One even left I was able to cover it up fine, but left a horizontal line because she didn't want to re-bleach the bleach sections. And I'm like, no, you can do that with me. Like I know it's scary on other people's hair, but my hair is resilient, and she just wouldn't. So I'm like, all right, now I'll just bleach over the bleach sections by myself.
That does remind me of the unfortunate time when I bleached my hair when I was in college, but we don't need to go into that here. Maybe,
Are there pictures?
maybe there should have been a legal limit to that. Uh, because of our beautiful federal system of governance in this country, we have 50 states. And those 50 states have a fair amount of leeway in making policy on a lot of different things. So one of those is, of course, these occupational licenses, almost all of which exist at the state level. Because of the beauty of federalism, we get some good state policy, but then we also often get some not so great state policy. So who are, besides Louisiana, who we have already mentioned, and it feels bad to say negative things about Louisiana during Mardi Gras season, but what states are the real bad guys when it comes to like too much licensing?
Yeah, Louisiana is definitely the standout. It's always my example because they also keep lots of really dumb stuff on the books. I'm just always so stressed out by them. But also partisan states, it tends to be worse in just because, if it's partisan, then there's not a lot of like electoral real competition. Then the lobbyists know who they're talking to and they're a little tighter in with them. And, it really does tend to work that way. Like, I feel like reform has been varied. Like, there's been a lot of reform in democratic leaning states for getting rid of licenses. It tends to be more of a Republican thing, but there is interest from Democrats. And I think the ideal situation is red leaning, but there's like actual blue. And that's where you see like some reform. So Arizona and Governor Ducey. And you want governors who lead on it, because I think if state legislators see they can get attention from the state for doing good stuff, that there's a little more incentive there. So South Carolina has done stuff, Utah, Arizona, Colorado. There's a lot of states that have done great things, but there's not. Texas has done some, Florida's done some, but like kind of like in the area around Louisiana, like that part of the South, it's been harder. Like there hasn't been a ton in Arkansas, but thankfully Governor Sanders is interested in it. So I think that area of the South and also the Northeast tend to be like kind of sad. Also California, California's always like regulations and stuff.
So there's a couple there's probably a couple different paths here to making things at least slightly better, which I think you sort of alluded to, where the obvious, big, easy solutions just say, well, there's a mandatory license to practice sex occupation, and then next year we pass the law and there's no more regulation. It's just all gone.
Right.
It's all wiped away. But there's some of these kind of like intermediate steps that would maybe placate some of the worries of the people who are in favor of licensing,
Right.
but would still create some liberalization. So what have you seen as the sort of like in between steps?
Yeah, and I'm always open to anything that'll make something less bad. Like if I'm not getting my perfect thing, I'm fine as long as it helps people. So like universal recognition is a really big one, letting people work across state lines. And there's various versions of it, but basically it says if you move to like Kentucky and work, then you can just have your license transferred in, and it's a pretty quick and simple process. Whereas before you'd have to like show credentials, not just credentials from your school, but school syllabi from 20 years ago in college, just asinine stuff. And this really makes it a lot smoother. And then letting immigrants work too, same idea, but for immigrants. And right now we have a lot of doctors in our country who cannot be doctors, even if their credentials are up to par. And even if they're not, they can't transfer in as nurses or physician's assistants. They can't really transfer into the system. Some stuff might, but a lot of it won't. So then they have to take 10 more years to become a doctor here again. Um, Criminal justice reforms basically saying if you get out of prison and you're, they're either enough time has passed or the license you're seeking has nothing to do with the crime committed or very little to do with it, that you can pursue that job. There's too many laws on the books called good moral character laws that just say, oh, the person must be of good moral character to get this license. Well, that can mean a lot of things, and it's arbitrary and intentionally so it just stops people from getting back into society, which is bad. Veteran and military spouses, making sure military spouses can have their license recognized very quickly because they move every year or two across state lines. And then for veterans, hasn't been done much, but skill matching isn't a thing. So if you were a plumber in the military and you come out, you're kind of screwed, which is bad because we should be helping our veterans. Everyone talks about veterans and, oh, let's help them. It's like, okay, well, maybe make sure that they can come back into society and work, and that we're not precluding that. The military equivalent of EMTs often can't be EMTs when they're out, stuff like that. Not to say that they might need that maybe they need a little additional training just to show here's how it's different or something like that. I'm open to that, but it should transfer somewhere into the system. So those are kind of the big ones, but there's also lots of little stuff along the way. Until recently, or not close to half of states allowed states to take away occupational licenses if people fell behind on federal student loans to force them to repay those loans. But like that wasn't happening because they could repay and didn't want to, because we put out a study years ago that found, yeah, it did get them to repay the loans by taking out more loans. Like it wasn't solving a problem. And so there's endless little pieces. You can reduce licensing. You can just say mandatory registration or inspections, or reduce the hours of licensing, make sure that licensing is a good means ends fit and you're getting rid of all the extra stuff. So there's endless ways, and I'm open to all of them. I want it better, not worse. But man, like some of this stuff just will drive you nuts when you're like, oh, this guy moved here and he was a prominent doctor and now he drives Uber because he can't be a doctor. And there's nothing wrong with driving for Uber, but it kind of sucks if you were a doctor and can't be a doctor here.
Right. I know that was one of the topics that was brought up in the great recent conference by Free Up, hosted by our good friend Ovik Roy. They had a panel talking about medical reform and licensing, and talking about how there's some really great, very highly trained physicians that would love to come to the United States and have a real problem with that. So one angle on this, I think, being in Washington, D.C., we work on plenty of issues that affect the states, but even for people who work on stuff that's mostly state relevant, there's a sort of kind of like Lord of Rings, Ring of Power idea that one federal rule can like override everything. And so rather, we don't want to have to fight all these 50 state battles. We'll just want Congress to pass one rule that gives us whatever we want. And obviously in this case, that's not really possible. So it's been sort of frustrating to some people who have that kind of like, we'll just have Congress pass the right law mindset. But you did point out, which I think was an interesting angle to this, like military and military spouses. I know there was a bill to allow military spouses or family members working on U.S. military bases not to be bound by those state regulations, which is like a baby step when it comes to like fixing the whole problem, but is an example of how some stuff is more federal and some stuff is more state, and you have to, if you want to respect the system, you have to like kind of route your solutions through the right way. And so even something like this that's overwhelmingly state, there are some things that can be done. Well, what does the federal government control? Well, the federal government has Army bases, Navy bases, in various states. And so they could at least liberalize that slice of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a handful of federal angles, but they're very narrow. One is the Department of Education caused the loans licensing issue. They put out a guidance document under Bush the First saying, oh, if you take away their license, they'll repay you. So basically putting out a new guidance document saying that was wrong. It's a little thing, but it would help just have that so no one forgets why we stopped doing it. Um, so that's one thing. So the Allow Act was really good by Mike Lee, but like you're saying, it's a baby step, basically saying that they can practice on military bases, and that's pretty narrow too. I don't hate it, but it's just kind of narrow. And then there's been bills to give funding to the DoD to like help states create compacts that are focused on military spouses and veterans, but can include others. That's a narrow way. But so there's a lot of little angles. There's also basically all of these are they're going to be really narrow. Like John Cornyn likes expanding the ability of funding to be used for licensing reform. I always forget it's a very long name of the act, but he always puts a little provision in there, and I do like it. But the rest really does, for the most part, have to be done by the states. The only thing is like, well, sometimes I'm like, man, I wish Congress could do this. Like, Congress could also ruin it. They could be like, well, we're going to encode the worst version of this. And I try to remind people who are like, why don't we just have a federal license? I'm like, do you want a federal florist license? Because that's how you get a federal florist license. Like maybe it wouldn't be that bad, but you might have a federal shampooer license and then you can't reform that regulation. So I like the competition of states, even when it frustrates me. I still think it's the best outcome. It creates data in different places. The only other big area that actually would be really helpful is for reform within the federal government itself. There's lots of licensed professionals who work for the federal government, and they can say we don't need the professional to be licensed, or we need them to have a different barrier or something like that, or we can expand their scope of practice from within. And I forget, but like including the military, I think the federal government employs like 8% of people. It's like a very high number. And if you can reform licensing for 8% of people, I'm open. Like we can see where this goes. So I think that's the angle they should be focusing on. Because the federal government often adds on extra requirements. But if they lead by showing fewer and that it's working, like that's a good way to do it. It's been done in a couple of cases, and there's bills to make it go further, which I would like to see move. But that's I think the big appropriate area for the federal government to work in licensing reform.
Well, yeah, the question of qualifications for government employees, I think, is an interesting one because one of the big policy issues when it comes to employment, creating economic opportunity for people, moving up the ladder, is the idea that everyone has to have a bachelor's degree, or everyone has to have a college degree to
Oh
do
yeah.
all of these jobs. And you've seen people in the private sector saying, well, we're going to roll back these minimums and say you have to have a BA to apply for this job or that
Right.
job. But also now some states have been moving in this direction too, where you probably know the state. There was a recent sort of, I don't know, you could call it descheduling, or where a lot of official job descriptions for state jobs, that college degree requirement was dropped.
Oh
And
yeah, a
so,
couple of states have done it. Pennsylvania, Maryland was earlier, Utah followed. Pennsylvania, I think, was the recentest one. I forgot the other states. There's been a couple more that have done it too.
so yeah, that's so I think that is like a very
Yeah,
close kind of like parallel positive
definitely.
trend that we've been seeing.
I'm a big
So
fan of that, reforming the system from within. And also with state government jobs, I think that can be maybe even more powerful because like that's like if they see that the state doesn't even care anymore, that can really be a big mover for industry. Federal too, but for state, I think especially a lot of companies look more towards what the state's doing than what the federal government's doing.
yeah, and I one maybe step sort of beyond that is we talked about that there are sort of like kind of halfway measures to reform short of just abolishing the state license requirements. And I wonder the sort of like, libertarian theory about, well, how do we achieve a good outcome without having it be a government
Yeah.
requirement, is that there are a lot of private training and licensing certifications, right? It doesn't have to be required by the state. You have, I know the real estate industry people always get angry when you say realtor to say real estate agent. So like there's lots of people who are real estate agents, but being a realtor is like a trademarked thing that
I
you have
always
to go
forget
through.
which is which. I'll always mess it up and they're going to
I
yell
think
at me.
I think they're like trademark IP attorneys that work for the realtor people who like send out letters
Freaking
saying no,
IP.
realtor is a specific thing. But it's an example of it's a sort of like private association, it's a system of training, it's a system of certification where they say, don't just go out and get any real estate agent, get a certified realtor, TM, because they have this more experience, or they have more screening, or they have more training. There's no reason why you couldn't have that in literally every profession,
Oh yeah, totally.
or even, stay with me here, competing ones.
Oh
Right.
yeah.
And so you could say like, well, I know a lot about the real estate industry, and the Uber realtors and the Realtor Max, or imagine there's like two competing ones, right?
Yeah.
And so they're both private certifications. They both have a certain list of things that their people have to qualify to, have to achieve. But there's two different versions. Maybe one's more focused on commercial, one's more focused on residential, or whatever it might be, right? The higher ticket properties, or the less expensive properties. But having, my proposal here is that the private certification is probably going to be better and cause fewer problems than the mandatory, it's illegal to do this job without certification. But we can also have multiple, even private ones. Because I think whenever this has come up in the past, someone says, okay, well, we'll get rid of the state licensing board, and then we'll authorize this private licensing board to do exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. I'm like, well, maybe that's a step forward, but maybe we can kind of like open our minds and think crazy, wild thoughts, and think that there would actually be competition even among certifications.
Yeah. Oh
Because
yeah,
I
I
don't,
love that. I think that's the way to go. Like, I mean, there's like just like with colleges, there's some that are known to suck and some that like aren't worth the money and others that are better and people can make their choices. Like I want more of that. And I think that that's the way to do it for all kinds of training. Even for doctors, I'd love an alternative to the AMA that's recognized by the government as someone who could certify. I think all of that kind of competition and specialization, like you're talking about, is really good. Um, and especially for stuff that shouldn't be licensed, that's one way to show. But also, just sometimes people learn on their own too. Like I learned how to dye my hair through Google and YouTube. I found a technique I really liked, and then I like practiced and mimicked it on my own hair. And I could do it for others, but I don't have a license, so I can't. But yeah, like I really think that we don't understand how great it would be to have like that kind of competition, and even where it has to be licensed, the government should recognize multiple paths to licensure, which might mean a test, or maybe a test and training, or maybe just you graduate from a certain program. But I think that's the problem with licensing generally, that it only recognizes one path and usually one organization, um, and or one test or one means. But sometimes there might be different ways to go about it. But licensure is so strict that it doesn't even, recognize veteran experience, or like, there's times when people are trained in prison to do things that they legally cannot do when they get out, which is insane to me. But we need more competition among all these things, among certifiers, and even where we keep the licensing among certifiers. Like oh, that's the dream. That's what I go to bed sleeping about, thinking about.
well, I understand some people come from the background thinking there must be one best way to do this. Therefore, there should only be one
Right.
certification, right? There can only be one right set of rules. But I mean, look how many organizations there are that certify like kosher food requirements.
Oh
There's
yeah, and some suck.
dozens.
Like there's really religious Jews won't go for the tablet K because like that rabbi is sort of half, but like the uh the circle K, the circle U, those are like very accepted. But it's nice to have that because then I know like how legit, like there's certain foods I might not buy if it has the tablet K on it. But the OU, I'm like, okay, we're always good here no matter what. And also, organizations get crappy over time. Like it might be the case that there's a new food that could have an ingredient that you have to be really, really careful about. And the OU starts getting lazy about it and it's like, oh, whatever. And then if they mess up, they'll lose that trust. And that's when maybe the tablet K rises and stuff. You have that opportunity to have that competition. And as the technology is changing all the time, including for hair color, like there's new brands that are doing things better or worse. So well, they're competing and figuring stuff out, and new techniques might be more useful to apply color or do other things. These certifying organizations and would have to evolve with them, and if they didn't, then they would fall and others would rise. But like people forget that how we have things now is not how they'll always be.
Mhm. Well, unless the government controls it and decides
Right.
never to reform anything, in which case that will always be how it be. Uh,
Exactly.
but thank goodness we have people like you, Shoshana, working hard to make it legal for people to get jobs.
Yay! I like helping, and thank you for having me on to nerd about it.
Absolutely. So please tell people where they should follow you and find all your awesome stuff.
I'm on the internet, uh, and at Senator Shoshana on Twitter, at RSI on Twitter. Rstreet.org is where all my things are. But yeah, I tweet too much. So if you want to see me tweet like 70 times a day, Twitter's where to follow me.
If you want to know about occupational licensing, sloths, and purple foods, and possibly purple hair, Shoshana is definitely the
Yeah.
place to go. All right. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.